Coming up on this week's show, we reminisce about zip drives,
the coolest Doom mod ever,
and we chat to modern vintage gamer on how to circumvent anti-piracy measures.
Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 214, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
and me, Joe Parks.
And a very warm welcome to this week's show. Welcome back, Ravi.
Oh, thank you. I'm feeling better now.
Over the man flu?
Yep. Not corona.
we did make that very clear at the start of last week's episode.
We were worried.
Now, you had to come back for this week's episode because today we're going to be joined by someone we've had on the podcast before who we're all really big fans of his YouTube channel. And it's a subject that we haven't actually covered for a couple of years now. Today we're going to be talking about the dark underworld of the video games industry, piracy.
Yeah, so previously we had Galahad on. And
that was one of our earliest episodes.
One of our earliest eps, but it was really popular. I think it's still one of our most popular episodes, and that was about the cracking group and cracking scenes. Today we're going to be talking to Modern Vintage Gamer about how to kind of get past the copy protection. Like every time a new console comes out, they always say, we're going to defeat the pirates. Nothing's going to be able to be copied on our system. But somehow, using tweezers, using strange devices, the crackers always manage to crack it.
I mean, did you have like mod chips in your PlayStation and stuff back in the
God,
day?
yeah, everybody and, anybody who was cool, man, around our area had the chipped PlayStation. So it was really cool to reminisce with him and talk about that, and kind of, he took us through from like, the floppy disk era all the way up kind of like to the PS3 and everything in between, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, and a lot of these systems, like you said, they always come out with them and like, the protection on this is unbeatable, no one's going to do it. Then there's always a way.
Yeah.
And some of them are the weird, like you said, tweezers.
Yeah,
That's really bizarre.
and usually it's like stuff like action replay and bits of hardware like Disc Doctor and stuff that it's always a little bit dodgy and grey area, isn't it?
That's one thing about piracy's always felt like it's one step ahead of where the rest of the industry is. And even today, I mean, how important it is for preserving old games. I mean, the fact that emulation, without the piracy scene back then, we wouldn't be able to play a lot of these games.
You download a lot of these classic games and the crack-tro comes up straight away. And you're like, if they hadn't cracked it, would this game be available?
I've heard stories of, I can't think of any specific examples, but, companies that have kind of re-released their old games or collections and they're actually the pirated versions of the games.
I've heard those stories as well.
I haven't got the source code anymore on that. So piracy's always been, since video games started, piracy's been part of the scene. So this is going to be really interesting. Kind of the history of piracy coming up this week with Modern Vintage Gamer. He'll be on the podcast in around 20 minutes from now. Now, of course, every week on the Retro Hour, we keep you up to date with what's been happening in the world of retro gaming. We've got some brilliant stories to talk about this week, including the return of Tiger's LCD handhelds, which I know Joe's extremely excited about. Before we do that, though, we need to ask for your help with something. Now, it's not very often we ask for your help, but let me explain a little bit about how this show works. We've done this podcast in the studio now that we're in now at 10 o'clock at night on a Wednesday evening. We've done it in here since we started, over 4 years now. And the thing about it is, this is not our studio. So we can come in here a couple of hours a week. We've got to work around other people and the schedule and that kind of thing. And that really kind of limits when we can get guests on. For example, next week, John Gibson's going to be on the show, which I think we revealed last week. You had to record that at home because it was early in the morning.
Because he was from Thailand. Yeah. So, we couldn't get the studio at this time.
Yeah, so, really, we're quite limited as to when we can get in here and record the show, hence being in here at 10 o'clock at night. And because it's not our studio, there is going to be a point at some stage in the future when we probably haven't got access to the studio anymore. So we want to keep doing the podcast, and that means either we have a couple of options. We could just do it on Skype at home with USB mics and headsets, which I think not being in the same room, that really changes the dynamic of the show.
Yeah, it kind of loses its charm a little bit.
A lot of podcasts do that.
And a lot of podcasts do that, and we can do that. Yeah. But it could lose some of its finesse and some of its charm.
And I think, I've got a background in broadcasting. Ravi, years as an audio engineer. We want the show to sound studio quality. That's something we've always prided ourselves on. So we're not really up for doing that. The other option is to get our own studio, which is what we decided that we want to do. Now, this is going to give us a lot more flexibility because not only can we come in any hour of the day, we can record guests that are all around the world, but also if we've got more time in the studio, we can do more things as well. For example, maybe launch a second podcast, which we've had an idea of doing for a while.
And we have been planning this for a while. So Dan's actually been gathering all the studio equipment. So, we've pretty much got the studio, so we
Yeah.
just need the space, really.
Well, out of my own pocket, I've spent about $5,000 on getting all the equipment ready. What we need, like you said, is somewhere to do it. Now, we've been looking. I mean, the other option is we could rent a studio, which we've looked at. I mean, to rent a studio like this to do the show in generally costs about £150 an hour. So, and we often do 5-6 hour recording sessions on a night. We're probably going to meet till 1 a.m. tonight.
Yeah, we're not very efficient.
And we have guests on, and schedules and that slips. That's not really an option. So we're asking for your help this week. Now, we want to build our own studio, which we figured, we need a few £100 a month to rent a space. Nothing fancy. We've got all the equipment. We're going to put it in there. But we're going to do something people have been asking us to do for a long time.
Yeah, so we've had the kind of kitty jar, which has just been a general chuck donations in, and that'll support the show. But we've had so many people from the very start of the podcast saying, you guys need to set up a Patreon.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing. And I know there will be some people that are like, everyone asks for Patreon donation. And I get that, which is, one of the reasons we haven't done it till now. We've always felt a bit like, is it the right thing to do? But I think if we want to keep this show going into the future, this is something that we have to do. We need to get our own studio. And, like I said, I've paid for all the equipment out of my own pocket. But we're giving you something in return for helping us out on this as well. Now, it is only a couple of quid a month. We'll make that really clear. I mean, the other option is that we could run more advertising on the show, which is something that we didn't want to do either.
No, yeah, we want to keep it to a certain level of advertising,
But, I mean, maybe you'd like to get the show with no advertising on at all, which is one of the things we're going to offer if you support us on Patreon. So we've got a few little perks that we're launching this now. We're hoping it's going to be a success, and we're hoping that you guys are going to help us out doing this and help us get the studio. So we'll link it up in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Essentially, not only will you get an ad-free show, but also you're going to get some extras, like a new podcast that we're starting called, do you like the name? The Retro Hour After Hours.
I do like the name.
We're quite proud of that, aren't we? We're going to be doing some bonus stuff like extra videos, behind-the-scenes things. A lot of people say we'd love longer interviews, so we are actually going to be recording extended interviews that if you're a patron, you'll be able to listen to as well. You can get stuff like Retro Hour T-shirts, and we'll be doing events and that throughout the year as well that I'm sure we can get you access to. So essentially what we're doing is, there are some perks in there, but we want your help to ensure that the Retro Hour's got a future after this year.
Yeah, and if you're not backing the Patreon, you're still going to get the Retro Hour as it is. Always be free for everybody.
Absolutely. We're just asking for your help if you want to help. We understand not everyone can, not everyone wants to. Absolutely fine. Keep enjoying the show for free each week. That's fine. But if you'd like to help us out and make sure that we've got a future with this podcast and we can improve it, it's going to make things so much better. Having our own studio, the amount of time we can spend in there, the amount of extra content.
And more guests, different hours from around the world as well.
Yeah, which is going to be absolutely amazing. So if you'd like to help us out on that, of course, that will be on our website, theretrohour.com, right in the front page. And we'll link it in this week's show notes as well. Any help we get, massively appreciated. Fingers crossed. Next week we've got one guy. He's like, I'll help you out, guys.
And we'll see.
Yeah,
it might happen, but we'll carry on either way.
Right,
he's just sitting there with all these exclusive episodes.
So let's get into this week's news stories then. Now, before we chat to MVG, I did kind of tease it before. Tiger are making a comeback with these retro LCD handhelds.
So I absolutely love this because at the same time, it's so ridiculous, but I love it. So Tiger are releasing, I think it's 4 LCT, Tiger Electronic games from the 90s. They're going to have The Little Mermaid, Transformers Generation 2, X-Men Project X, and an absolute classic, Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And these are going to be available really soon. It says in GameStop.
Right.
For $14.99, batteries not included, but there is
They never are
they never are. Batteries not included. It states exact replicas with the amazing artwork and everything of the they are the Tiger game, the Tiger LCT handheld game consoles. Like I'm so excited to see these in game and get some for Christmas.
And you know they are the true 90s ones because they've done absolutely no improvement on them.
Oh no. Yeah, there's still the LCD screens. They probably for the same price could have put like a nice little digital screen
or
in
an option for a Bluetooth controller or something.
But no,
like that.
they've still just got like the 2 buttons on them and stuff like that. They've kept it completely retro. I'm hoping in the UK they're kind of like pop up on Zavvi and in FOP and places like that. And I'm fingers crossed like my mum and my boss at work buy me them for Christmas.
That's what's going to happen. I mean, to me, these just bring back memories of heartbreak.
Yeah.
Christmas morning, yeah, Grandma's got you Sonic the Hedgehog. Oh, she's got me a Mega Drive. It's one of them. It's
Yeah.
It was always
Thanks, man.
Grandma as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You like some video game things? Let's get him one of these. And you remember these games? I mean, there weren't anything complicated.
Oh, God, no.
It generally had the background that was either just
If
kind
you
of
look at them in a
static.
certain light, you
Yeah.
can actually see everything at the LCD at
You're right.
once.
It could.
And it was usually like free animations, like
Yeah.
left, forward, and
You know,
kick or
and
something.
I think by the kind of 2001, you got them in a Happy Meal, with McDonald's. But I'm super excited for this.
See, Tamagotchi obviously had a bit of a comeback a few years ago. We talked
Yeah.
about that. But I don't know. I kind of feel like this is one step too far. I'm already feeling sorry for the kids that will be unwrapping them on Christmas Day this year.
I don't think too many kids are gonna get them. I think it's gonna be like us who are gonna get them on Christmas Day. Let's be honest. But I think they're cool.
If I have kids, this is all they're getting.
Yeah. Ravi the strict dad. So, yeah, if you do want to get hold of one of those, they're going to be out very soon, just when we thought we'd seen the back of them forever. Now, let's talk about Doom. I mean, Doom is obviously, we were chatting about it last week, you and me, Joe. It was a game that really was a benchmark in video games in the 90s. Changed everything, that game. But also, not only the fact that it was technologically very advanced for the time, and a great game, of course, but also the scene that came up around Doom.
Yeah.
The modding community that
Yeah.
continues to this day.
Yeah,
Now-
the open sourcing of the engine
Yeah.
led to so many people taking it up and just doing crazy things with Doom and Quake as well, actually.
Well, this is something that I know you've been very excited about. Zombies Ate My Neighbours and Doom mashup.
I absolutely love this. I love Zombies Ate My Neighbors. One of my favorite games of all time. So yeah, somebody has spent the time to completely recreate the first 3 levels from Zombies Ate My Neighbors in the Doom 2 mod. It's GZ Doom, it's called, but
Right.
it's Doom 2 mod. It looks fantastic and it plays so well from the video. I wanted to put it as like my retro pick, but I was like, this is so good. Like, we need to talk about this for a couple of minutes.
I've actually seen one recently, which was Chaos Engine, which was
Yeah.
done exactly the same time. It was like 3 levels at the beginning.
Yeah.
They'd imported the enemies.
Yeah, this is what they've done here as well.
Perfectly, you know.
They've got the sprites, and the sprites are still like the 2D sprites from the actual game, but it just literally I'm so familiar with like the first 20 levels of Zombies Ate My Neighbors. They've got the level, the sizes and the scales of the levels and everything. Like,
They got the trampolines working.
They've got the trampolines working as well. It's spot on. Like, I love it. I absolutely love it. So, I would love to get my hands on this and play it. I don't think you can at the moment. It's just a video, but
Right.
I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for it, and I'll probably be talking about it again if you can play it.
Because normally they just release these and you can just play them on the, like you said, the PC version of it. I
Yeah.
mean, it's all open source now anyway. So, and that's the thing. I mean, I think it's awesome as well that id Software were just so relaxed about everyone doing this kind of thing, and they put the source code out there. Everyone just enjoyed the game after they made the money off it. I mean, you say that. I was looking the other day though on the Nintendo Switch. They put out Doom 1 and Doom 2. I don't know if you saw it for about £1.49.
Oh, really?
Really cheap. And actually, Doom, the original Doom, was number 2 in the Switch chart the other day.
I
amazing.
saw an interview with John Carmack
Yeah.
on Joe Rogan's podcast. And
Yeah.
it was basically him saying, we put the Doom source code out there. So in 100 years, they'll still be like, oh, let's try and get Doom to run on it.
They'll still be making mods probably in 100
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
For Doom, so long may it continue. Now, my mum actually used to work on those big mainframe computers back in the day. I've talked about this on the podcast before. She was like a systems operator back on the mainframes in the 70s. And I've got great pictures of her. I mean, she had this machine called Dora that she used to work on for the council. And they do like pay slips and all that kind of thing through it. But it was actually probably double the size of the room that we're in now. And I think the printer was probably about the size of this desk in front of us. But, I mean, back then she used to tell me about how she used punch cards. Do you know what punch cards are?
I think so. The only thing I can think of is like how you log into work back in the day.
Well, essentially,
they were data storage. They were
Yeah.
like later on they had ticker tape for stuff like the P1, stuff like that. But the punch cards were actually data storage. But we're talking about these because of a book that's celebrating punch cards. But I've not actually never seen this fact before. But apparently it started in 1890.
Wow.
Okay.
Using
That is
them
retro.
as data storage until
That could
the
be as
70s,
retro
so-
we've ever got.
Yeah, 'cause punch cards, I mean, they were essentially binary. So you had like little holes where the zeros
Yeah.
and ones would go. So, yeah, rather than having to make the programs every time. I mean, a lot of it back then was switch-based. So, turning switches on machines. This would actually do the switching for you when you put the cards in. But this book then, I mean, I love the picture on this article here on Creative Boom. All the different coloured punch cards as well, like the red ones and the yellow ones and purple ones as well. Quite visually striking. I've never had a system myself where I've used punch cards before. But they reckon that this kind of reveals a lot of information about unseen data and things that we didn't know in the past then.
Yeah, because they've got stuff like bus tickets. They've got
Right.
kind of information on truck vehicle orders. And,
Sounds interesting, gotta say.
all this old stuff. But also, they've got like the laser cutters at the moment. So they're cutting the covers with laser cutters.
Right.
So they look absolutely beautiful and precise. And this book is going to have over 220 punch cards featured in it.
I actually do find that kind of stuff interesting. There's like some stuff on Reddit recently I've been looking at, which was people that have got like old books that were in libraries, and someone may have left like a bus ticket in there from the 60s or something. And just kind of seeing that stuff, like relics of a time gone by, I've always thought is quite... There's a story behind every one of them. Someone made that journey, you know what I mean?
Something I like to do, and it's like kind of irrelevant but relevant at the same time, is whenever I buy a game, I always put the receipt for the game in the box.
Right.
And I always find it interesting because one game I always go back to is Call of Duty Black Ops, which it's about 9 years old now or something. But it's interesting to see that I've been doing that for like 10 years now. And I always go, I bought it for $49.99 or I bought it for $25. And I've always done it with like my PS2 games and stuff like that. So it's interesting, that people used to do that with bus tickets with books and stuff like that.
Do you remember where you were when you got the game as well? Like when you see it?
It comes back to me,
Yeah.
I bought that in HMV. And it's just like, can't remember the last time I bought a game in HMV. Do you know what I mean?
Well, this book also has a really cool name, Print Punch, Artifacts from the Punch Card Era. So check that out. It's from Patrick Fry Studio.
Yeah, and if the picture's near anything to go by, essentially there's some beautiful imagery in here of like the punch card era and these classic machines as well. Again, it's something that you don't see all that often. It's just, obviously we've been aware of like punch card systems and the old mainframes and that, but visually as well, if you ever go to like, computer museums or the science museum where they've got these old machines like Craze and that kind of thing set up, they look incredible. They always look like...
even if you think like Craze would be like the modern things compared to like Teletype and some of the really old stuff. So, these guys were caning them out in the 1890s, yeah.
So if that wasn't nerdy enough for you, should we talk about zip drives?
Oh, yes. Zip drives. They were fantastic, weren't they? Do you remember having a zip drive done?
I did. Now, I remember using them first of all. I think we had them at school, when they first came in, because actually they celebrated their 25th anniversary this month, which is why we're talking about it. And there's an article here on howtogeek.com talking about, 25 years of the zip drive, why we still remember it today. The thing I remember about it is when I first saw the zip drive is how cool it looked. Because back then, you remember everything was kind of mid-90s PCs, generally looked a bit boring, the beige boxes and...
They were all beige. You never got any black plastic, and that looked really cool. But also, the fact that you could just have so much information on there, 40 megabytes. The sizes were varying throughout the time that it actually got developed.
Yeah, it went up. I remember them being about 100 megs when I used them. We have USB sticks on our keyring and all that now. It's so easy to transport data between systems. But back then, I remember being at school and using floppy disks and downloading files off the internet and having to split them up over about 5 or 6 disks.
Yeah.
And then rebuilding them or joining them at home. When you got a zip drive, though, having 100 megabytes that you could just put in your bag and take it home with you. Before USB came along, that was revolutionary. There was CD burners were really expensive then. I think to burn a CD cost about $2,000 in the mid-90s.
Yeah. So they're saying, eventually zip rose up to around 250 megabytes, and then finally 650, which was kind of getting close to a CD-ROM size, isn't it? And there's all these strange formats like Pocket Zip that I never even heard of, Photo Show as well, which is a really weird one.
Because it did keep going for a while into the early 2000s, and I think that...
Zip CD, did you know?
There was one that was like an MP3 player. You know what Minidisc tried to compete with MP3 by having it on a physical format. Yeah. No one ever used any of that. I mean, really, Zip's peak was mid to late 90s, wasn't it, really?
Well, there's one thing that we're never going to forget, which is the zip click of doom.
Yeah.
And that would be if it would mess up, you'd get this awful click
Yep.
and your drive would be gone.
You knew it was broken then, yeah. But zip drives, I mean, there's something that was very much of its time. And I've actually got a zip drive at home, and I need to go through these actually. I wanted some blank zip disks for it. I had a little project where I was trying to get some stuff onto like an old Windows 3.1 PC. Didn't have USB and all. I thought that's a good idea. We'll use a zip drive. But I actually went on eBay and I bought a collection of about 20 zip disks for about $5, and they've all got stuff on them. There's like handwritten labels and things on them. So I haven't looked what's on there yet. I've had them about 4 or 5 years. But that's my job for the weekend, I think. Uncover what's on these long lost zip disks. Probably Doom mods.
There's your first Retro Hour After Hours episode.
There you go. All about my zip disks next week. No one's going to back that now. Now, before we get into this week's chat, talking about anti-piracy measures and the history of cracking, let's talk about Altered Beast as well. Now, we've talked about Altered Beast on the show before. A game that weirdly is considered to be a crap game generally now, which is really weird because I remember loving that game in the arcades and on the Mega Drive.
Isn't it funny? Because Altered Beast is like, I think we all wear rose-coloured glasses when it comes to it. I remember getting it on the Sega Mega Collection, but one of the first ones for PS2 and being like, oh, bloody hell, yeah, Altered Beast, what a game. I remember when my mate brought that round and we caned it that afternoon. And then me and my mate, we sat down, we played it. And then before you know it, you're like, oh, is that it? Do you know what I mean? For 10 minutes kind of thing. Isn't it funny that it's got such a legacy when it is only like a 20-minute game and it's not got any replay value at all other than the fact that it's kind of difficult?
I love the fact that, you could just transform into different things.
Yeah.
I thought that was what impressed me at the time.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like, it's kind of like a tech demo for the Mega Drive.
Yeah.
Because, it's got the transformations, it's got the sound bites, it's got the, the American Werewolf in London, how when you transform into the wolf and stuff like that. So I kind of see it as like that kind of like tech demo, but this is another one that's been fan remade as well, isn't it?
So essentially there's a fan remake of Altered Beast. With 3 different modes in there as well, using Construct 2, the game engine for that. And it looks pretty good. And essentially, they're releasing this for Android. You can play online on a web browser, Windows, Linux, Mac OS as well. No iOS version at the moment. But really, it's just a complete fan remake from the ground up.
It was a very early Mega Drive game, wasn't it?
It was the release game.
Yeah.
The release game.
Yeah, that's why I said it's kind of like a tech demo.
That's why
it was bundled
I
with
didn't have that much exposure to it. I remember playing like versions of it on other systems that were awfully badly ported.
Yeah. There's versions on the Amiga and stuff like that, and they're notoriously bad.
Yeah,
So-
I shouldn't start trying to talk Sega. I'll leave
But
it to Joe.
it was Altered Beast, super fun to play. I want to say Italia World Soccer or something
Right,
like
1990.
1990 or something. Maybe that came a little bit later. But it 100% it came out with the Mega Drive.
See, next time I'm in my local supermarket, I've told you this story before. I was wearing a Sega t-shirt at my local supermarket, and this guy's like, aha, retro video games. I'm like, oh, yeah. He goes, Sega Mega Drive. What was the first game released on the Sega Mega Drive? I was like, God, that's hard. I actually thought Altered Beast, and I said that to him. I was like, probably in the UK, was it Altered Beast? And he went, no, Sonic the Hedgehog. I was like, no, that was definitely... And he got really aggressive, angry at me. Yeah.
Didn't he? But you started arguing with him, didn't you?
Right in the middle of that thing, yeah. I run a podcast, mate. Yeah, I didn't say that, don't worry, but yeah.
But yeah, Sonic came June 91, I think it was.
Right, yeah, it was way later.
Yeah, much later, yeah.
So, but I do remember Altered Beast being a really early game, and it's cool that it's got a fan remake. It proves that there are more fans of Altered Beast in the world than just me and you, Joe. So there you go. If you want to check it out, I'll put a link to that and everything we talked about in this week's show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, of course, this week, we're all about giving big thank yous to people who've supported this podcast. And of course, every week on the show, which we'll continue doing. If your back is on our new Patreon, you'll still get a mention in the Hall of Fame as well. There are a few different options on that. Obviously, check out the new Patreon on our website. But we're keeping PayPal open as well for people that might just want to make one-off donations. This all, of course, really helps, goes back into the running of the show, and we'll get us closer to this goal of building our own studio a bit later on this year with your help. And of course, for making a donation of any amount, we roll out the red carpet and you find your place on the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Like this week, Stephen Quinn,
Carl Busby,
Darren Glenn,
and Andy Cooper, who all made donations into the running of the show. And if you'd like to do the same on our new Patreon or by PayPal, you'll find those links on our website at theretrohour.com. Now, every week we give a little shout out to little projects and YouTube channels and stuff that we've been looking at this week in our retro picks. Now, I've got to say, a huge shout to Kwang from Asobitech. Now, we had him on the podcast a couple of years ago. And finally, this week, Mayo Mayo Castle got released.
Oh, that's an awesome game. We've played so many.
Or is it Mau Mau Castle?
I think
Mau
it's Mau Mau,
Yeah,
like
okay.
a cat, meow meow.
Yeah.
And
Like a what, Ravi?
Yeah, I got it wrong just so you do the impression.
we've played this game. It's fantastic. It's using your hand
Yeah.
to kind of control a crazy flying
Oh,
cat.
I've
It's
played-
a bit like
Yeah,
Space Harrier.
I've played this drunk. It's a great game.
Yeah, we played it at Play Expo probably about 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago, wasn't it?
I guess that was in like beta then? Or?
Oh, yeah, but very early version, but it's finally come out this week, and I believe it is actually available for free download at the moment if you want to get it. It's released for free. There's like a Mac version, a Windows version he's put out already. And like you said, we played this game 2 years ago, and I remember being blown away by how much fun it was. I was absolutely terrible at it. Might have been something to do with having like 6 pints of Carlsberg beforehand, but it was. I do remember it being loads of fun, and it's available now if you want to give it a download. So support indie developers as well. You're all about indie games. Now, you've been playing board games.
Yeah, so I've been playing this fantastic game. It's by James Simon Bradley. It's called Civitas Nihilium.
Another show that we did in the past.
Yeah. And it's basically a solo board game that's been developed mostly using the Commodore Amiga, so using Deluxe Paint and stuff like that. And it's set in a cyberpunk universe. And you have a soundtrack. So you kind of put the soundtrack on, you play the game, and it looks really interesting. I've got all the stuff at home. I'm going to have a playthrough on my YouTube channel. So hopefully I won't do too badly. I'm awful at these kind of games. But yeah, so come and join me with that and check out Civitas Nihilium. It looks really good.
Well, if you're playing it on your own, at least you can't lose.
Yeah, that's it. Well, maybe. Straight away I die.
Joe sent me the most amazing clip. And this was, do you remember Tomorrow's World?
Yeah.
Yes.
I used to love Tomorrow's World on TV.
Great show.
Sorely missed Tomorrow's World. Now, this is a clip talking about on this day in 1984. It was a little section they did about the fact that, you might be fed up playing your latest video game. You'd have to go out and buy a new cartridge for your Atari or something. But they had this incredible system where you could essentially download new games from a vending machine. Have a listen to this.
If you enjoy playing video games at home, there's something new for you too. Not a new game, but a vending machine which sells them. I'll just explain the system. Now, normally, if you get fed up with playing a game, you have to go out and buy a whole new cartridge. But because this is a special, reprogrammable cartridge, all you need to do is take it back to the shop and buy a ticket for the vending machine. Inside here, there are over 300 different games. It simply consists of a computer which stores programs for all the different games on a hard disk. Well, the computer is now asking me what type of machine I have at home, and mine is type A. And so it asks me to insert my cartridge in the top slot. Well, it will now run through all 300 games. I'll spare you that, and I'll go for number 1, Dragonfire.
So it's a flashcard, essentially.
How far ahead of the curve is that? When I saw that, I saw it a couple of weeks ago. It just reminded me of so much like what we've gone through over the last kind of like 20 years as well. And I've seen the Game Historian episode about where Blockbuster actually tried to do something with the Mega Drive and the Genesis, a really similar thing. And then it just reminded me so much of downloading games now, on your console and stuff like that. I thought it was crazy.
It just reminded me that like car boot sales were like my vending machine. You go up to a guy who'd have 300 games.
But just that they did have that back in the 80s, and it's just it's crazy it never took off.
That was like the 80s version of Steam.
Yeah.
Essentially, or Xbox Live. You go with your cartridge, put it in, flash it with a new game. That's a really good idea. It's weird that I never saw them anywhere. So I imagine,
never saw them.
Yeah, they didn't get released or they never took off.
You'd be annoyed though if they got it wrong though. Somehow there was a little like bug when it got flashed, and then you came home and you're like,
Yeah, how do you get a refund off the vending machine?
Yeah, there was probably some sort of reason why it never became mainstream. Maybe it just wasn't very reliable, or she said, I'll save you the time. by, just picking the first game, maybe it took forever to like download one.
Game 299.
Yeah.
And you got to write it to the cart.
Yeah.
I imagine. But yeah, what a cool, very ahead of the time concept. So you want to check out any of those we talked about, there'll be in our show notes at theretroad.com. I think we should bring back Tomorrow's World on YouTube. Get Ravi like a brown suit or something. I can picture it now. We could do that. I'll get some thick glasses.
Challenge Annika afterwards.
Joe's booty.
Yeah, man.
Anyone outside the UK now is like, what? Yeah, look that up on YouTube. Right, then let's get to this week's special guest, modern vintage gamer, talking about the history of piracy. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And today we're going to be joined by someone who's actually been on the show before, but we've got quite a lot of new stuff to cover on the podcast this week. It's actually been 2 years since we last caught up. And of course, I'm talking about Dimitris from Modern Vintage Gamer. Welcome back, Dimitris.
Hey, thanks for having me back on the show, fellas. It's great to be here. And yeah, it's been 2 years. I can't believe it. A lot has happened in that time, but it's great to be back on the show.
Well, we were talking about your YouTube channel last time, and I think last time we spoke, you'd just hit around 100K, and now you're close to around 400K. You must be pretty pleased with the progress of that then.
Yeah, it's been good. It's been going well. A lot of work, obviously, to get there. It's not just, sit back and watch the subs roll in. There's obviously a lot of work that's involved, but I really enjoy doing it, and like to come out with interesting content every single week. And I think people, the viewers, the fans, they're all kind of responding well, and channel's going great.
Well, last time we had you on, we were talking about emulation, and you had a lot of involvement with emulators and optimizing stuff. Now, today, we're going to be talking about defeating copy protection. And I was wondering how much defeating copy protection helps when building or optimizing an emulator.
I think it's quite important. I mean, if you think of it, it's a pretty general question, so I'll kind of answer it in with some specifics, Ravi. But essentially, there's always going to be some one-off games or some ROMs out there that had custom chips in there or some type of security mechanism. So emulators have to be cognizant of those things as well. But the good news is, because an emulator essentially is just the CPU code running in a loop, and then the chips that are also being emulated, the video chips, the sound chips, you have complete control over the machine emulation. So you can easily just, I'll say, just kind of skip over things, that we know are copy protection type anti-piracy type stuff. And it just means you have a lot more control over things. So in a general sense, if you like fire up a game like, Earthbound on the Super NES, which is notorious for having 4 layers of copy protection, what you'll find in an emulator is that they just patch out those routines. That they know that, this is the protection routine. We're just gonna patch that out. We're gonna just jump over that part. So obviously there's a lot of work that's being done there on that front.
Do you ever worry that talking about these kind of subjects like emulation and, copyright and stuff like that will ever affect your channel, or like any sort of like demonetization with it?
That's a great question, Joe. Yes. I do worry about it sometimes, and I have been. I'll say I don't want to say I've been targeted or anything like that, but there's been some close calls that have come up in the past. But I think for me, I don't really want to stop talking about those things. I think it's important to, when you talk about like game preservation, and you've got historians that talk about the history of a game or the life cycle of game development that happened back in the 80s or the 90s. I think this is a very important topic to discuss as well, how things were defeated, how copy protection works, how anti-piracy measures were implemented in certain systems and certain games. So I do think, it is something that I want to continue doing, whether I get, close calls or I get YouTube, telling me you can't do that anymore. I think at the end of the day, if really it comes down to, YouTube saying, look, you can't do that anymore, I would probably just continue doing it on another platform, honestly. I'd probably continue doing YouTube, but I would still talk about the anti-piracy stuff on another platform.
Well, let's talk about your personal history then with getting around copy protection. I remember being a kid and, a teenager, and those long late nights with X-copy sessions, my friends over, and going through loads of blank discs and doing copies of games. I mean, what was kind of your experience then when you were young?
Sounds very similar to mine, Dan. When I was in college, or even actually going further back, I mean, when I was in elementary school, we would schoolyard copy VIC-20 cassettes. Pretty soon after we got the VIC-20, it was the schoolyard copying, and that transitioned on to the C64 and the Amiga, believe it or not. So, and then when I kind of got into college later on, we would definitely have X-copy parties and things like that going on. There was a lot of that stuff. I mean, we would buy games, the games that we really, really liked, we would buy, and I've got a pretty decent Amiga big box collection that I've had since I was growing up back in those days. But there was a lot of the X-copying type stuff going on. Absolutely.
I remember back in those days, depending on the company, the kind of strength of security would be different on the titles. And, there'd be some that you could do straight away in X-copy, and there'd be some that you couldn't. You mentioned in your video about floppy disk protection, faster than light copy protection, and it being one of the most devious pieces of protection in history. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so the game Dungeon Master that came out originally for the ST, and then a little later on for the Amiga, the kind of the first person dungeon crawler that came out, had a pretty ingenious copy protection method in there. There was two types of protection in the game. The first one was there was like the unreadable sector, that was pretty standard back in those days. If you think about like Rob Northern protection, you probably heard that before. It was, you put the disk in the drive and it would say not a DOS disk or any, on the Amiga, because there was that unreadable sector. You could read it with an action replay, and that's how a lot of the crackers got around it. And defeating that protection wasn't too hard. So Dungeon Master had that protection. And a lot of people left it at that and said, "Oh, I've beaten the protection because we kind of cracked the unreadable sector." But there was also the second protection, which was even more ingenious, and that was the fuzzy bit or the weak bit, and that's the one where somewhere on the disk or in multiple places on the disk, there is a certain bit that will read a 0 or it will read a 1 indeterminately at random, depending on any type of factor. So if you put the disk in the drive 10 times, it may read a 1 6 times, and it may read a 0, the other 4 times. And the company FTL knew that it was a copy of the disk if it only read a 1 or a 0, because it meant that it was obviously copied. So they put all sorts of really interesting measures in the game to kind of mess with the player. So you'd be kind of walking through the dungeon, and you click on a door to open it, and nothing would happen. Or you would throw a throwing weapon in the air, or you cast a spell and it would just suspend in the air, or you'd get a guru meditation, or you'd be told to insert disk 0, all sorts of just random stuff. And the interesting part about Dungeon Master was it wasn't something that happened immediately, and it wasn't something that that they came out and said, "Hey, you're playing a pirated copy of the game, stop doing it." It was they'd let you play the game for maybe an hour or two and get a couple levels in, and you get kind of comfortable with playing, and then all of a sudden something would happen to really mess with you, and you realized you realized something was going on. And to the crackers, they weren't really sure whether it was a bad crack of the game or if it was just a bug that was in the code, so they weren't really sure. So the actual game I believe it took like a year to actually be fully cracked on the ST and the Amiga. And by that time, the company had made pretty much all the money that they would ever make on sales of the game, because obviously you make a lot of sales in the first couple of weeks of putting a game out on retail. So they actually made a lot of money on it, and the protection was actually was very successful for them. And it was something that is still being talked about. When you go back and look at the archives of anti-piracy stories, Dungeon Master is definitely one of those ones that's up there as one of the most ingenious ones.
You touched on, some of the devices used there. So, like products like Disk Doctor, did you know if they were illegal, or did they kind of like occupy a grey area of like a development system, if you will?
I think it was more of a gray area. I mean, I don't think there was anything illegal specifically about a disk doctor type program being developed. And back in those days, I mean, computer programs were being developed for all sorts of different uses. So I don't think it was dubbed illegal by anyone. I mean, I think you could buy a copy of that in a computer shop just right next to the latest games. But it certainly is a gray area, especially when you talk about Disk Doctor and Xcopy and those programs that were mainly meant for the piracy of software. So yeah, it's a good question.
It's quite ironic. I never knew anyone that actually owned an original copy of Xcopy.
They're a rarity now.
Yeah, I don't have one, but I've seen the box, and I got to say, I wouldn't mind getting my hands on one. That'd be a cool collectible to have for sure.
Well, one video that I remember you did was the Unhackable Playstation 3, and that was a really interesting story about how the operating system was used to class it as a computer, and then that turned out to be the vulnerability in the system, didn't it? That's
correct. So with the PS3, if you recall, it came with Yellow Dog Linux as part of the bundle. So Sony actually advertised Linux as a feature of the PS3, and with a mouse and keyboard and just a monitor, you could literally turn this game console into a kind of just a consumer level desktop computer type of thing. And you could do all sorts of things with Linux. But I guess one of the side effects of that was people like George Hotz, GeoHot, the same guy that hacked the iPhone, started snooping around with the hypervisor on the under Linux, and Sony was paying attention to what he was doing because he was basically blogging about the things that he had discovered while using Linux under the PlayStation 3. And I think their solution was essentially just to stop Linux altogether. So they brought out a firmware update. I believe it was in April of 2010 that essentially that's killed off the Linux environment on the PS3, which in turn got them in a lot of trouble because of the big class action lawsuit that I believe is still they're still settling payments to this day. Would you believe? It's hilarious that that's still going on. But I guess the damage was already done. There were already people that were looking into beating the protection on the PS3, and I think Sony's biggest kind of downfall there was that in the end, because they removed Linux, it really kind of angered a lot of people in the community, people that wouldn't necessarily take action on something like that, but there was then a kind of a rallying kind of concerted effort to get Linux back on the PlayStation 3, and in turn that's kind of what that's what ended up happening with its demise, and they ended up finding the root keys and all sorts of things, and they ended up defeating the system completely. And basically being able to sign a custom firmware that you could just install as a firmware update on your PS3, which brought Linux back on the PS3. So it was a very interesting time for Sony. They learned a lot of lessons from that one for sure. And I think that the biggest takeaway there, at least for me, is don't take Linux away from a system that already has it, because you're going to anger the wrong people, and they're going to find a way to bring it back, and that's what ended up happening.
It's quite ironic actually, because it must have cost them quite a bit of money, But I do remember reading that the only reason they put Linux on there was like for a tax break, so they'd actually get a better tax break for classifying it as a computer, not a console, which obviously kind of bit them in the behind, I guess, in the end, didn't it?
That's interesting you say that. I mean, I think Sony's always been a little more kind of an open environment or an open system than, say, the Xbox. Like, I did a video recently on the Net Eurose on the PlayStation 1 where, it was like a consumer-grade dev kit where you could build your own games in your bedroom, and then on the PS2 there was Linux as well. So you could run Linux on the PS2 that Sony had an official distribution, and they kind of brought it forward to the PS3. So I've always felt like they've left the door open for the hacker, the bedroom coder, the guy that wants to tinker around with their system, that option to turn the console into more than just a game system.
It's really interesting. Every time a new console comes out, they always talk about how their format is uncrackable and how this is the greatest new technology. I remember when the Dreamcast came out with GD-ROM, and they had the wavy lines on the disc, and there was holes in certain places and stuff like that. It was pretty strange because when the Dreamcast came out in the UK, a group called Utopia released a boot disc pretty much straight away. So could you tell us about the Utopia boot disc?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that the Dreamcast. I mean, I think Sega kind of came out and said, this is really secure copy protection that we have here. And if you really think about it, it really was, because at the time there was nothing that could read a GD-ROM other than a Sega Dreamcast development kit, of course. So if you put a GD-ROM into your disk drive or your CD drive on your PC, it wouldn't read the disk. It would just say, put this into a Dreamcast and play the game. But the Utopia disk was interesting because one of the biggest exploits that was quickly discovered was the mill CD, the multimedia CDs that you would get with the Dreamcast, and there was only a handful of them that ever came out. I think there was only like maybe 5 or 6 of them that were ever released, but I guess the most popular one is kind of the add-on disc that came with Space Channel 5 in Japan, and it was just this like extras disc that had extra music on there, and I think maybe a music video on there or something. But that particular disc was just a standard CD-ROM. It was just a standard 700 megabyte CD, which was a standard kind of ISO 9600 kind of format CD. And in the end, they realized, well, if these discs can boot on a Dreamcast, well, how do we make just a regular, CD boot on a Dreamcast? And they kind of went from there. They quickly realized that there was an exploit found that allowed the Dreamcast to boot just normal CDs. And that's how the Utopia disc started. They basically built this, region-free kind of disc loader that would just load a small program on a burnt CD, and then it would just wait for you to put in, a backup of a Dreamcast game, and then it would just boot from it. It was very, like, in the end, it was probably the weakest form of copy protection that was ever kind of put into a console. But Sega had kind of relied so heavily on the GD-ROM format being unreadable that they didn't realize that maybe we should tighten up the security on just kind of regular CDs, or that the mill CD format being implemented as part of a protection method to get defeated.
So with the CDs on the Dreamcast, were they just completely self-booting, or did they have to come up with something with that?
At the beginning, the Utopia disc essentially takes the boot sectors from a mill CD, like a Space Channel 5 disc.
Oh, okay, right.
And so it just kind of boots off of that. And then later on, they quickly figured out that, well, we don't need a Utopia disc anymore. We just put the same boot sectors from the mill CD onto each of our games. So if you download, and I'm not saying anyone should, but if you download one of the kind of echelon cracks, or one of the echelon kind of rips from the internet, all the kind of the boot sectors are the same. It's the same kind of mill CD format that was used on the Utopia disc. So in the end, they realized that you didn't need a Utopia disc to do that, and that was quickly found pretty much, maybe a couple of weeks after the Utopia disc had come out. It was quickly realized that, hey, we can just boot off of any game that we want to.
Well, what's the difference between breaking copy protection and running unsigned code?
So the difference, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think in some regards they're one of them the same. But let me kind of give you some examples. I mean, unsigned code is essentially just when you develop code on, I'll just use a game console as an example, like the Xbox. That's a pretty kind of straightforward way to describe it. But if you're developing code on a development kit on like an Xbox, and you're testing it on a development kit, or you're testing it on a debug kit, that code is unsigned. And what unsigned means is it hasn't been sent to and I'll just use Microsoft as the example, hasn't been sent to Microsoft to be signed with their private key. And the private key is something that no one ever has access to. It's something that the company or the publisher has at their offices, that is usually not known by anyone what that key is. So that private key will then sign your code or your piece of code or your game for it to be pressed onto CDs and then kind of get out into the retail store. So the difference there is that cracking something is when you have a piece of code, but you're kind of manipulating the code. You're kind of changing the bytes around, or you're patching a routine to say, hey, if I'm about to jump into a copy protection check, let's just skip over that. And I think that's kind of the main difference there. But having said that, Dan, with kind of console game type cracking that went on, like on the PlayStation and the PS2 and things like that, the Xbox, you'd need a modded system anyway to run unsigned code in order for those cracks to work. So it's almost like there's a dependency there, or there's a dependency between the two things. So both of them, kind of share a lot of similar things, but ultimately, unsigned code really means when it's kind of being developed on development kit before it gets sent to get certified by the publisher.
And I guess stuff like that leads to huge homebrew scenes. So the Xbox, for example, led to Xbox Media Center, which then kind of went on to Kodi. And I was just wondering kind of how hard was it to originally crack the Xbox and to get that unsigned code running on there, considering it was essentially a PC?
It was very, very quick. It wasn't like the Dreamcast, but it wasn't that far off the Dreamcast from what I recall. When the Xbox first came out, a lot of people were interested in knowing how to, like you said, run Windows software on it, because essentially it was just a Celeron based system that had PC parts kind of literally off the shelf almost, that was in this game console kind of form factor. So there was a lot of quick discoveries that were done to try to defeat this thing, but it wasn't really until Bunny, Andrew Wang, was the first guy that got hold of the Xbox, and he ended up building literally a packet sniffer that would kind of sit between the CPU and the kernel, like the kernel ROM on the flash chip. And he was figuring out what was going on between there, and he quickly realized that there was a secret ROM that was kind of stashed away somewhere else in the internals of the system. And he was able to extract the secret ROM, which ended up having the key, the private key to the system. And from there, he was pretty quickly able to determine that, hey, with this key, I can now, flash a new firmware. I can decrypt the firmware. I can do all sorts of things. And essentially, it was very quickly after that unsigned code was able to be run on the original Xbox. It was something that Microsoft really didn't put too much into their security of. I think they took a lot of, they were quite naive at the time when they were developing the Xbox. I didn't think security was a huge factor. It was certainly something that they were interested in. I'm not saying that they didn't do any security on the system, but they were very lax on the security on the original Xbox, and it was quickly defeated. And then kind of later on, there were also the save exploits that didn't require you to wire up a mod chip inside, that would just utilize the save game exploits, where you would have a player profile name that was like 50 characters long when it only would accept 10 characters in the name when you would put your name in the game, like Splinter Cell or something. And those types of things would trigger these kind of weird buffer overruns, and then allow you to run your own code, which ended up usually just being, a bootloader to load into a dashboard, which had FTP, and then you could connect up to FTP and start, inserting all your ROMs and your emulators into the system pretty quickly.
Do you think there's like quite a large risk with people going public with these exploits, like where they could just get instantly sued, or it could just get instantly patched out and all their hard work's kind of gone to nothing?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of different things going on right now, like with the Nintendo Switch, which is pretty well known that the earliest Switch models have the jig exploit, where you literally insert a paperclip into the right Joy-Con, and you can boot it up into RCM mode. And then there's the PlayStation 4, which also has, I'll say, a small, but there is a scene there, and there is ways to defeat the PS4, provided that you have a system under a certain firmware revision. But those types of things, quite honestly, I would say that, it's the best thing to do is leave those alone. I don't think there's any value in going public with any exploits that are found on kind of current generation type stuff, because number one, they're going to get patched, because we live in an age of hypervisors, and the Xbox One and the PS4, they can self-update pretty quickly without too much difficulty, because everything kind of runs in their own little kind of walled-off virtual machines and things. So getting kind of root level access is next to impossible these days. So any exploits that are found, would usually come under a lot of interest by the company. But, for me, I think it's okay to talk about the old stuff that happened. If you go back 10 years, 15 years, the Sony PS2, the PS1, the Xbox, the Dreamcast, systems like that obviously are no longer around and haven't been for a long time. I think it's okay to talk about those types of things without any type of repercussions. But I would say, yeah, anything that's kind of modern day, I would probably, not touch it. In fact, I mean, I've been a target of Nintendo taking down some of my videos for that exact reason, on the Switch. So, I mean, I think right there is proof positive that you should probably not talk about, the kind of the current stuff that's out there. I think it's probably the best thing to do.
Well, I remember a stage at school when suddenly every kid seemed to have like a mod chip in their PlayStation 1. Do you think the process of like turning these hacks and mods into commercial products has become quicker with manufacturing improvements in recent years?
I think so. I mean, you've got these kind of companies that make these simple bits of hardware that allow us to mod systems easier. But I will also say that the days of the 20 wire mod chip that you would solder onto your motherboard, I don't think those days are really around anymore. I think these days it's really more about the software type exploits. So if you think about the Switch, and if you think about like the DS and the Wii U, all of those were exploits via software mods that occurred. And I think that's really where things have been going for quite a while. The hardware modding stuff it's kind of a lot more about the older generation of systems and less these days. But it's really more about, the software mods. But even still, to your point, I think, these kind of mod chip makers, like I'll use Team Executor as an example. I mean, they still release these kind of tools for, I'll say, the folks that have heard about, I can mod my Switch or I can mod my Wii U, but I don't really know, how to do it. I don't want to read a 20-page guide on some GitHub page. Is there an easy way for me to do it? Is there like a one-click solution? Where there is a way to do that, I think there are mod chip manufacturers out there that have come up with solutions to do that for sure.
Well, talking of kind of hardware hacks and how hard they were back in the days, I remember the PlayStation 1 would be defeated with a pen. But the PlayStation 2 was very hard to hack with that tray, that kind of front-loading tray. Did that cause a lot of issues? I remember a thing called it was like a credit card that you put in and you had to slide it left and then force the drive open.
I don't know if I've ever heard of that one before, Ravi, but the PS2 was a lot more sophisticated. That I think there was 3 levels of security on the PS2. There was the swap trick approach, where you could still swap trick a PS2, but it would only work with, I think, the CD-based games, not the DVD-based games. But there was also additional checks in there. There was a chip in there called the Mechacon, and that really was almost like a hypervisor before a hypervisor really ever existed, and that took care of a lot of the security on the PS2. But it wasn't foolproof, as we know. I mean, there were certainly ways to work around and defeat the protection. And then you also had companies like Daytel that were releasing these action replay discs. And if you remember those discs that you'd put in with all the cheats on the disc, and then you would put the game in to cheat on the game, Daytel somehow figured out how to boot these discs that were unlicensed on a PS2 that didn't even have a mod chip in there. And I remember, and I've told this story before, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but what Daytel ended up doing was, and this is a true story, they ended up taking an original PS2 game, and I believe it was Crazy Taxi, and they just cut out the security sectors physically from that game, and they transposed it onto their action replay discs, and that's how they got their stuff to boot on the PS2. It's a fascinating story, and a lot of people say that that doesn't even make any sense. But I tell you, if you still have an action replay disc laying around on the PS2 and you put it into a PC, it will come up and say Crazy Taxi as the name of the disc. So it's actually a true story. So there were different ways to defeat the PS2, and I think in the end, there was like a mod chip that really kind of beat everything. But if you recall, there were so many different mod chips and different ways to get things to work, and there wasn't really a one size fits all approach. But in the end, later on, I think that it was like the Messiah chips, or I think it was called the Messiah chip, that was really the one that kind of beat all the different types of protection on the PS2.
So talking to the action replay, which is one I'm actually really familiar with myself, and obviously, it's a huge history of helping access games and pull out code and stuff. How did the product help defeat the Gamecube protection?
It's interesting. The Gamecube protection was something that was already defeated before the action replay had come out. What ended up happening was the exploit was found with Phantasy Star Online. So the way this all went down was with Phantasy Star Online, when it came out on the GameCube, it was quickly realized if you changed the DNS settings, you could just point to your local computer rather than the PSO servers that were running at the time. And from there, what ended up happening was, if you wrote a little program that just listened to the port that it was trying to connect to, you could essentially just dump the contents of the disk and all the memory from your GameCube. So from there, it was quickly realized that, hey, there's no encryption on any of this stuff. So none of the files are encrypted. There's no additional security. There's no hypervisor. And in the end, that was what really kicked off the action replay on the GameCube. It was determined how the boot process worked, and it was quickly determined how to essentially replicate the boot sectors on an action replay disc on the GameCube. And in the end, that's how they ended up making the action replay discs without needing a mod chip.
Well, after that, the Wii came along, and at the initial launch of that, I remember people talking about the fact that it was a very secure console. Obviously today, massive homebrew scene on it too. And that was defeated by a pair of tweezers.
That's correct. That is correct. It's a bit of a, I won't say, I mean, it's an interesting story. I'm not sure if the tweezers was the only thing that beat it, but it was certainly a part of the process. And in the end, the Wii again was something that had come out, which was quite secure when it was first released. There was a lot going on, and there was essentially there were two processors inside the hardware, and there was the OS that was running. When you would turn on the Wii, you'd see the familiar kind of the Wii screen where you could load your games and manipulate the system, your memory cards and stuff like that. That was actually called iOS, not to confuse anyone with Apple's iOS, but the Wii also had an operating system called iOS, and it was quickly determined that you couldn't get access to iOS any other way via, normal methods trying to, sniff it out or something like that. But as it turns out, if you attached a paperclip or a pair of tweezers across the data bus, the address lines on the chip, you could get access to different memory locations. And the way it ended up being defeated was, if you guys remember, you could play GameCube games on the Wii. So when you boot into a GameCube game, Nintendo did not clear out the memory of the Wii portion before they loaded into the GameCube portion of the Wii. And in the end, some smart hackers were able to, with a pair of tweezers, were able to essentially just crawl over the memory locations and extract the iOS, the operating system, and from there they were able to extract the keys and get access to the system. And by that point, it was pretty much done. It was defeated quite quickly.
Well, I was absolutely fascinated to see your kind of anti-piracy arcade video, because I couldn't believe that people were pirating Capcom boards and stuff like that. But you were talking about a console called the CPS Charger, which was kind of a failed Capcom console. How did that help defeat the protection on arcade games?
Well, what ended up happening, Ravi, was this. It's actually called the CPS Changer. I just found that out myself because a lot of people corrected me on my video. But,
I've been researching, watching your videos. So.
Yeah, right. The CPS Changer is essentially a home console for Capcom arcade boards. So I think there was only a handful of CPS Changer games that ever came out, but it was kind of Capcom's failed attempt at bringing their arcade games home back in those days. And essentially what happened was there was one particular game, I think it was Street Fighter 02 or Street Fighter 0, that was a almost one-to-one replica of the CPS2 version with some minor differences. And that was really what started the whole thing, because before that, no one really knew how to extract the CPS2 game and kind of without kind of silside the CPS2 games because of the silside battery that was in each of the CPS2 ROMs. And with the encryption that was going on with the CPS2, if you tried to extract one of the ROMs with an EEPROM burner and maybe change some bytes around to have a different version of the game just wouldn't boot, because there was some pretty sophisticated protection in the CPS2, and then coupled with the silside battery meant that it was almost impossible to make a bootleg of any CPS2 game. But it ended up being the CPS Changer that really kind of opened up the door a little, and some hackers discovered that, well, now we know how this all works. Maybe we can reverse engineer what our discovery is and figure out how to get access to the CPS2 ROMs and how to make that work. And in the end, it was really the CPS Changer and the Street Fighter 2 game that was kind of the starting point for that. And then from there, it was just a matter of understanding how the silside process works. That was quickly discovered that once the board kind of dies, once the battery dies and the contents of the RAM in the battery gets lost, then it's just a matter of all the code lives in a different memory location. So they ended up patching that back to what they knew it was originally. And then from there, they discovered that there was also a key that was found, and that was used to decrypt the ROMs as well. And with those two things, they were able to work around it. But to your point, I mean, CPS2 arcade boards, for the duration of the life cycle of CPS2 in the arcades, there was a total of 0 bootlegs. So Capcom's security was really, it really held up quite well for many, many years. It wasn't really until much later. In fact, it was like 2006 when it was kind of first discovered how to kind of de-silside a CPS2 board. And then much later, in fact, 2013 was when we found out how to actually revive a CPS2 board that had silside and kind of bring it back to where it was, back in, from the factory.
Well, I mean, talking about copy protection that stood the test of time. I've still got scars on my fingers, I think, from trying to install mod chips in the Sega Saturn. And I know that was only in recent years that actually kind of, was be able to be software modded. It was really difficult. I mean, why was that so tough? What was it about the design of the Saturn that made the copy protection so strong on that?
I think there's a lot going on with the Saturn. There was different levels of security that they had implemented. But honestly, it's something that I'm kind of looking into right now. And I want to learn more about it myself. I mean, I know from a high level, there was kind of 3 different levels of protection that they had implemented, coupled with the fact that the actual hardware itself is quite complex. I mean, if you take a look at the system, there's a lot going on there. There's all the different chips and everything, that a lot of developers were talking about how difficult it was to develop for. And I think the same thing applies for people trying to defeat protection. Where do you start? It's such a complex system with so many different chips and so many things going on. But it's definitely something that I'm looking into right now for an up and coming episode. So stay tuned on that one, because I'll definitely have more info on that. But at the moment, I mean, there's not really much else that I know about the Sega Saturn, other than just, I guess, from a high level, that it's a very, very complex machine in so many different ways from a development standpoint, and also from a protection standpoint.
And have you ever had any of the pirate groups or cracking groups kind of contact you and reach out to you for help with cracking consoles?
I have, not necessarily for help, but I've had a lot of different folks from different groups, from different generations, going all the way back from folks that were in Razer and Fairlight and Paradox. Telling me their stories, because I'm really fascinated to hear stories about stuff like that. And, I want to learn about how cracks were done. I hear about one game that took a year to defeat or something like that, and I want to know how it was cracked, and I'm interested to hear what process was used. So, yeah, I've had a lot of different I guess, ex-scene members reach out and chat with me about, their story. And I think it's very interesting to go back and listen to what they have to say.
I remember when Steam came out and people were saying this will be the end of piracy. Now we've got video game streaming. Do you think that will put a stop to piracy? I
think ultimately what will put a stop to piracy is, and maybe you're saying the same thing, Ravi, is the whole games as a service model. As much as I hate the kind of the newer games as a service where everything's always connected to something for some reason, I think ultimately that's where the industry is heading with that type of stuff. And, it really means that, well, if you're not connected to our servers over here, then you can't play the game. And I think, game streaming like Stadia and xCloud and stuff like that's definitely another way to gatekeep or control, the experience for the person, and maybe make it less easy for someone to copy or pirate something. But I think the other thing I'll say is, and I look, full disclaimer, guys, I haven't done this for many, many, many years, but games are so big these days. I mean, we're talking like 100 gigabytes to download a game these days. Red Dead Redemption is like a 100 gigabyte game, on a couple of Blu-rays. I mean, who's got the time and the bandwidth to download 100 gigabytes worth of a game on a torrent site anymore, and then try to figure out how to make it run on your PC? I think things have changed a lot in the scene, and maybe I'm a little bit naive about that. There's probably someone listening that's telling me that no, it's still alive and kicking, and maybe it is. But for me, I just think the size of the games that we're dealing with these days really just puts it, most people, except I guess the hardcore folks, puts them off, and maybe it's just easier to just spend your $60 or your or whatever at the store and just get the game and do it that way. Or like to your point, Ravi, just video stream it or use a game streaming service in order to do it. I think that's really where things are going.
Yeah, I think you make some good points, and there's kind of a wider conversation about stuff like I remember when World of Warcraft came out and people just kind of made their own servers and connected to that, but also then they were creating classic servers, which then kind of force Blizzard to think, oh, this is popular. Let's make some of our own official classic servers. So, yeah, it's interesting to see what the future will hold.
Definitely. And that's a good point. Yeah, World of Warcraft. I mean, they essentially took the ideas of kind of just the community, and they did it themselves, and they monetized it. And from what I've been told, I don't play World of Warcraft, but what I've been told, it's very, very popular and very successful.
Well, what can we look forward to in your channel then over the next coming weeks?
I've got a whole bunch of different stuff going on, Dan. There's more anti-piracy stuff coming up, so you guys will like that. Ravi will. But I did an Amiga video last week, and I've got the urge to do more Amiga content, so I'm going to go back and look into that again. But just a little bit of everything. I mean, I've been doing like a segment on how graphics work on kind of these old systems like the Game Boy Advance. So I'm going to kind of continue that series as well. You know, for me, it's really, I don't have a schedule. I don't sit down and pencil in what I'm going to do for the year as far as videos. It's really more about what feels right at the time, and it's like, you know, it's literally a week in, week out type scenario where I'm like, okay, what am I going to do next week? And I come up with something. So I guess, you know, in summary, I guess more of the same as what you've seen over the last 18 months. There's a lot more coming down the pipe. And
we're going to be seeing you in person as well in a few months' time. You're coming to Flashback 2020 in the Netherlands this summer.
Yes, I am. Amiga 35 Flashback. Yeah. I'm psyched about it. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to it. Never been to the Netherlands, so going to really enjoy the countryside as well. So I'm very, very excited to be going out there.
You'll have to get some clogs.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's what Ravi wears all the time anyway.
Just hear me clopping down the street.
Well, Dimitris, it's been a pleasure catching up with you again. Congrats on the success of the channel as well. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on the show, gents, and have a good one.